Welcome to the PARC Forum. In 1958, today's speaker was finishing up a degree at Cambridge in medieval Indo-European languages. Meanwhile, in another part of Cambridge, the University Engineering Society had a film series for its members, and they had by mistaken gotten the film Rashomon by Kurosawa, which our speaker had wanted very much to see, and hadn't seen in the theater, and it wasn't out on video yet. And so he decided that he would be willing to join the Engineering Society just to be able to see this film, which he did. Now, in the process of joining, he discovered they had a contest for the best undergraduate paper with a prize of £25. And so he resolved to parlay his expertise in medieval Indo-European languages into this £25. The only problem is the paper had to be about engineering. And so he put his tongue firmly in his cheek and wrote a paper titled A Translator Machine. It won the £25 and a job offer to work on machine translation, and he hasn't looked back since. SSL's own Martin Kay.
And since then, I've been to every other movie that Kurosawa made, but somehow none of them had quite the same effect on me. I've talked about this subject before a number of audiences and on a number of occasions, but I've only recently actually gone back to the canonical title for this, namely machine translation. I used to hedge and talk about machines and translation, or 10 years ago I talked to this group on the proper place of machines in language translation. But it's now becoming almost respectable to talk about machine translation again in this country, and I figure that in this generally rather supportive audience you'll let me get away with it. At least that's the experiment that I'm going to try. Before we can talk about machine translation, we'd better get some idea of what we mean by translation. So I thought we'd start by looking at some more or less good examples of it. And it's easy to do that in a variety of ways, but one of them is to get hold of the Scientific American, and you'll find in there, there's a little ad somewhere in there that informs you about how you can get translations of it in about a dozen other languages. And these actually come out about 2 months later, and they're superbly well done. They're as good an example of the craft of translation as you can easily find. So going with this one, there is one, for example, this one in French, and you can't always tell them by the picture on the front, but there's this one in German and so on, and there's one in Japanese and in Russian and in Arabic and in Hungarian and so forth. So what you can do, if you want both to find an example of what translation is really about, and also to find examples of all the incredible difficulties that real translation entails, that's to say translation as real professional translators do it, you can just go through here. Let's try this now. You can just pick some page, just pick any sentence at random, and you'll find almost the whole collection of difficulties and horrors that any designer of a machine translation system would have to face in that one sentence. So let's pick this one here, which I just happen to have on a slide here. Actually, it's picked essentially at random. It's the first sentence from the first substantive article in this particular special issue on AIDS from October of 1988. Now, so what I've put up here is the French translation of the original, and then underneath it there's some English that goes with it, and it's the sort of English that you might see if somebody gave you this in a third-year French translation class. Il y a une dizaine d'années, 10 years ago. You know how to translate that. By the third year, that would be straightforward. On croyait que, it was believed that. Les pays industrialisés, that industrialized countries, and so on. Not quite word for word, but little by little, it goes along. You look up occasional things in the dictionary, you know a few common words and phrases, and it all works out just nicely. The trouble is that what I'm showing you is not the English original for that French translation. It's a translation that I made in just the way that I was outlining for you. If you look at the real original, it looks a little bit different. It looks more like this. As recently as a decade ago, it was widely believed. Now, where has as recently as gone? Well, the answer is away. Because it's a phrase which has a certain resonance, a certain roundness in English. It doesn't actually convey anything very important. Trying to get it into French is simply more worry than it's worth. You are better without it. A machine, of course, could quite easily make a judgment of that kind, as all you programmers here would understand that right off. It was widely believed that. Now, following that, we have what linguists call an embedded sentence or a subordinate clause, that infectious disease was no longer much of a threat. So the subject is infectious disease. On croyait que les pays industrialisés, that's the subject of the French sentence. So the thing has been entirely recast. What is the subject of one is another part of the other sentence. The whole thing has been completely rearranged in order that the rhythm and the ease of understanding shall fit the modalities, whatever those may turn out to be, whatever subtleties there may be behind that, that makes it really sound like French. Generally speaking, these translations are good enough so that you can't really tell when you look at them which is the original and which is the translation. The French is really French in every possible sense of the word. Various other things besides as recently as have been changed. But we know, of course, in our third-year French class, we would know not to do what some of the early translating machines would certainly have done. Il y a une dizaine d'années, there are about 10 years. Even there is about 10 years, I suppose, for that matter. On croyait que, one believed that, or even one was believing that, because there is no distinction in French between these things with ing, these so-called progressive tenses. Était débarrassé de was cleared of, was being cleared of, and a whole lot of other ways that one might have translated that. La santé publique looks as though it ought to be the public health, but it certainly doesn't read the least bit like English if you put the in there in that particular case, for reasons that any one well-designed algorithm will have no difficulty working out. So, what sorts, can we break down the sorts of horrors that we find in here into some classes? And of course we can. There are the obvious ones that everybody knows about. Everybody knows that words are ambiguous. It was widely believed, well, sometimes widely ought to be largement, and sometimes it should be généralement, and sometimes, as in this case, it shouldn't be. It just disappeared, like that other word, like whatever it was. I'll never forget whatever it was. Year can be an or année, depending upon whether you're thinking of it as a point in time or as an extent in time. A tree can be an arbre if it's growing in the ground, or an arborescence if it's the sort of thing that computer scientists draw on their whiteboards, and so on. Everybody knows about lexical ambiguities of this sort. Generally speaking, lexical ambiguities can lead the translator to a situation where he has to add information in his translation that was nowhere to be found in any obvious way in the original. So, for example, the garden variety word chair in French has to be either chaise or fauteuil in French. And actually, I don't know what you people are sitting on now. It's sort of more chaise-like than fauteuil-ish, I would say, but it's sort of difficult. The word is actually one way that you can sort of tell. When you translate these things back into English, it turns out that generally speaking, you sit on a chaise and in a fauteuil. So if you could think of the chair that you're talking about as being something you would sit in, the likelihood is that it's being a fauteuil. Now, what are you doing with these seats, I ask you? I leave that up to you. The word window can be fenêtre. That's probably the commonest meaning of it. That's if it's an ordinary window in a house. Devanture, somebody's going to tell me that one of those E's ought to be an A, but for most of you it doesn't matter, and I'm certainly not going to worry about which one. This is the kind of window that things are displayed in stores. Window is a guichet, however, if it's the place where you buy tickets, that kind of window. No, everybody knows no, don't they? It either comes out as kennen or wissen or sapere or conoscere or connaître or savoir or whatever the language happens to be. Every language makes a distinction that English fails to make, so much so that if you learn a number of languages and come eventually after 5 or 6 of them to Russian, you will look around trying to find what the other word for no is in Russian. And there isn't one, because Russian is just like English from this point of view. And so on for various other words. Even the verb to be in Spanish has got 2 equivalents, but everybody learns about that in Spanish 1. Works the other way, of course. The word tasse in French can be either a cup or a mug in English. You might like to work out one day just exactly what the dividing line is between a cup and a mug. A porte in French can be either a door or a gate. Can you tell me just what it is that distinguishes a door from a gate? It's not completely clear to me. It's something perhaps to do with whether there's something going over the top. If there's nothing over the top, it seems to me it's fairly clearly a gate, but some gates do have something over the top. Walk and run in German turn out as gehen and laufen, but they get sort of mixed up in the middle there, and some of the walks become laufen, and most of the runs become laufen, and generally gehen comes from walk, but they sort of get crossed over in the middle. Laufen stresses the fact that it's on foot, that you have to work for it. Now go in English comes onto gehen and fahren, according to whether you're doing it under your own steam or you're doing it by car, train, airplane, or something, some means of transport. Chercher in French can be either to look for something or to meet somebody. If you go deliberately to meet somebody, of course, it's chercher. If you meet somebody by chance, it's rencontrer. So it all gets mixed up in a way that we all sort of have a vague feeling for, some of us more vague than others. Certain semantic areas get totally confused. Here is something that I thought I might confuse you with. It comes from a recent book by Makoto Nagao, Mr. Japanese Machine Translation, if ever there was one, who has recently had his book translated into English, his book being called Machine Translation, How Far Can It Go? He doesn't actually answer that question, but it's a good title. The notion of cooking, he claims, my Japanese isn't up to this, can be divided up into these various ways of cooking things, barbecuing, charcoal barbecuing and grilling and stir-frying and so forth. And these sort of map onto another set of terms in Japanese, but very rarely do the lines actually correspond correctly to one another as you would like. This yaku thing seems to cover a certain amount of frying. The more you stir, the better, by the look of it. But it also covers toasting, for example. I'm slightly surprised to see bake and roast separated by toasting, because I know the difference between toast on the one hand and bake and roast on the other. But although I think I rarely get them wrong, I haven't the slightest idea what the difference in English is between baking something and roasting it. I just know that you bake ham and you roast beef, and maybe that's all there is to it. Sometimes the added information is quite systematic. Very few things in this game are systematic, so we'd better be grateful for them and recognize them when we see them. When translating from French into English, especially pronouns, you have to know whether the thing that the pronoun refers to, however far back and however remote that reference may be, you have to know whether it's animate or not, because you are going to have to choose to say either it on the one hand or he or she on the other. The French will give you a very good way to distinguish between he or she, but it won't give you any distinction between those two on the one hand and it on the other. It only has il and elle, because everything has a sex in French. You see, they're like that. You also have somehow to put certain verbs in the progressive. That's that form I am walking as opposed to I walk. He was doing it as opposed to he did it. They don't have that distinction in French. They have it in Spanish, but it doesn't correspond quite to the one in English, so that doesn't really help you as much as you would hope. If you're translating from English into French, again, he, she, and it cause you problems. It particularly, because you have to choose whether to make it translate into il or elle or le or la, depending on whether it's subject or object. And the only way you can do that is to figure out what it refers to. And figuring out what things refer to is in general not something that a beginning programmer can do. I mean, it's not something you would do in BASIC. You know what I mean? It's a real, at least a Pascal sort of problem. Translating from Chinese into any Christian language requires you to introduce articles because Chinese doesn't have any articles. Numbers, because Chinese does not require you to distinguish between whether you are talking about a man or men or a house or houses. It does not require you to say whether something is past or present. These are required in English. You cannot produce an English sentence without making these distinctions. In Chinese you don't have to, and indeed in lots of languages you don't have to make some or all of these. Translating into Japanese, you have to get the honorifics right, and you don't stand a chance. Certain kinds of distinctions between words have to do with whether they are used in a very sort of literal-minded way or whether they are used in what's called a more effective way. So ivresse, which means being drunk, if it's referring literally to a state of rolling drunkenness, it's likely to be translated as drunkenness, whereas if it's the sort of thing that you get by looking at the Monet murals in the Jeu de Paume, then it's more likely to be intoxication. Maigre is thin if it really is something that you could measure with a caliper, but it's meager if it refers to things like the budget or something like that, and so on for word after word after word. I have to say something about aspect because it's sort of standard these days for linguists to do that. This is the current thing one of the current things which every linguist knows is just plumb impossible. Suppose you are translating from French into English. You learn in French one that never becomes ne verb, the verb in the middle, and then jamais, so as in nous n'avons jamais demandé, we never asked. But you see, we don't always use never the way the French use it. Sometimes we use it to refer to a single occasion. There was not a single occasion on which we asked. And you don't say that way in French. Now, so long as you know that that's what it means, it's no problem. So there was no occasion on which we asked something like nous avons oublié, preferably with an L in it, but not necessarily, de demander. He never thanked me. There was never a single occasion on which he thanked me. The French don't use jamais for that. They use something else, and I've invented something for that to be. Or take something like, elle a déchiré either sa robe, which means her dress, or la lettre, the letter. In one case, this probably means she tore her dress. There was a little tear in it somewhere, in which case we would say it in English, she tore her dress. Elle a déchiré la lettre is likely to mean she reduced it to small pieces, in which case we would say that in English, she tore up the letter. She did it real good, see? So that's something that the French, it's a distinction the French doesn't make. There are all sorts of ambiguities, some of them plausible, some of them implausible. One cannot resist showing a few implausible ones because otherwise one would sort of collect them and they would fester inside one and one would never be able to let them out, and one has to be able to do that occasionally. Walking down Alma, I saw something saying slow men at work, and indeed, the Armenian earthquake moved buildings as far away as Rome, Moscow and Rome. One wonders what happened to people that were on the route in between. Royce Hall at UCLA has written over the proscenium arch, education is learning to use the tools that the race has found indispensable. One wonders whether they will replace it by something else when the learning has been completed. All sorts of ambiguity. Linguists love ambiguity. One of the problems with machine translation that I hope to come to before we get through with this is I'm going to point out that one of the things that we have learned since we started working on machine translation is that there are more kinds of ambiguity than we ever used to think of. So we've learned about more ways to interpret things, but we haven't learned very much about how to distinguish them from one another. And that's what we're going to have to do. If we go back to what I had up here originally, that very first thing, it said, as recently as a decade ago, it was widely believed that infectious disease was no longer much of a threat to the developed world. Now let me read that for you again. As recently as a decade ago, it was widely believed that infectious disease was no longer much of a threat to the developed world. In which case, by golly, you'd better translate it differently if that's what it means. In this case, that is not a subordinated conjunction anymore, it's an article. And that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of that sentence. You would never have noticed it at the beginning of the article, but we could have set things up later on so that you would have given it this interpretation quite naturally, I claim. More syntactic ambiguity. It's a favorite one of mine. Perfectly innocent looking sentence. His paper shows that smoking can cause cancer. One interpretation, probably the intended one in any reasonable context. His paper shows that cancer can be caused by smoking is a reasonable paraphrase of it. However, it could also mean his paper shows cancer can be caused by that smoking. His paper shows that smoking can cause cancer. That smoking you're always doing. Or his paper shows cancer being caused by that smoking can. His paper shows that smoking can cause cancer. I mean, it shows it cause cancer. It shows it causing cancer, as it were. Consider these sentences, versions of which I owe to Ivan Sarg. I'm deeply indebted to him. Suppose that you see these two sentences. I claim that your interpretation of them will be different and that it can only turn on one thing because this is a reasonably controlled experiment, isn't it? There's only the country which differs, right? Now, I claim that there are two translations that you need in German. Ich hatte vergessen, wie gut Bier schmeckt. I had forgotten how beer tastes good, as it were. Or ich hatte vergessen, wie gutes Bier schmeckt. I had forgotten the taste of good beer. All right? Presumably, if you do, I don't need to go through it for you, do I? I mean, most of you know what it's all about, don't you? Famous problems of prepositional phrase attachment. I bought a car with 4 doors. Presumably what it was that had the 4 doors was the car. I bought a car with $4. It's just possible you went through the car after you bought it and found $4 in it, but that's probably not what it means. I saw a girl in the park with the telescope. What's going on? Did I use the telescope to see the girl? Probably. However, it's quite possible that it's like at, Santa Monica or somewhere where there's a park out there with telescopes in it. And the place where I saw the girl was in the park with the telescope. Or what I saw was the girl. Which girl? Well, the one in the park with the telescope. Indeed, the more prepositional phrases you add to the end of a sentence, and by golly, English speakers add prepositional phrases to sentences, the more interpretations you get, and it does make a difference. They do translate differently, Not always, but often enough to be embarrassing. Now, consider these two sentences. The council refused the women a permit because they advocated violence. The council refused the women a permit because they feared violence. Now, here we are. That's they, by the way. I'm just trying to keep you on your toes, right? Because they feared violence. Now, is the distinction between these sentences something that you learn in French 3 or French 2 or some linguistics class or from a grammar book? No, it's something you get from reading the San Francisco Chronicle. That's the only way that you can distinguish these from one another and figure out what the word they refers to. Presumably, it's not the council that are advocating violence in the first sentence. And presumably, it's not the women that fear violence in the second sentence. But it could be, couldn't it? But in order to translate these, you've got to have read enough of the San Francisco Chronicle or some other highly regarded journal of that sort to know what's going on and who's likely to fear what and advocate the other. Some things you might claim as a first approximation are just plumb untranslatable altogether. I collect translations, as you might gather. One of the things that I've collected is all the James Bond novels in a whole lot of different languages. And there's one, I've forgotten which it is, which starts out with one paragraph's worth of very detailed description of a bridge game. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter who wins, or it doesn't matter what hands anybody's playing or something, but it's all done in detail just to set up the local color. Now, they don't pay the people that translate these things very much. And the person that did the Spanish version of this hit on by far the best way of dealing with that first paragraph. It's not there. Try translating into a language of Borneo 2 no trumps, for example. The chances are there's no way to do it. Or try translating into a Zulu language alimony. How long do you think it would take you to get the notion across? You would have to write an appendix, which would be larger probably than the thing you were translating. An end run. I brought this up in a discussion with somebody just a few weeks ago. I have used making an end run around people ever since I came to the States, and that was a long time ago, 30 years now. I learnt this last month that it comes from football and not from baseball. I didn't know that. Turns out you can't translate the word nut into French. There's nothing that means nut, just, one nuts, there's no word that means that. All different kinds of nuts, but not just a nut. Utilities, gas, electricity, so you can't translate that into French either. You've got to be specific or work your way around it or describe it or something. There's nothing that means the utilities, as far as I know, anyway. Then there's a whole bunch of adverbs in German. I was trying to look for an example of this on my way to a conference recently, and I was almost there, and I was going to have to talk in 2 hours, and there I was standing on Frankfurt Station, and somebody said that the train I was going to get on wird voraussichtlich 5 Minuten spät ankommen, which means will predictingly, I don't say predictive, well, it is predicted that is what this adverb means. It will arrive approximately 5 minutes late. And we don't have an adverb in English that means that. We don't have one that means beziehungsweise either, which means sort of according to whatever it might be according to. According to stuff, as it were. So I use I think with the word beziehungsweise. It's just very, for somebody who sort of has a loose way of thinking, it's extremely handy. Since I have some association with the Center for the Study of Language and Information, I have to have a slide with this as its title, but it doesn't mean anything. It was actually pointed out to me by Jean-Marie de la Beaujardière that it is not kosher if you are talking about some particular food, would have to use kashir, it means kosher. But if you mean that's, you know, in the everyday use of this phrase, what you say is ce n'est pas chrétien. Ce n'est pas catholique. It's catholique, you're right. Better still, isn't it? Better still, it's not kosher, ce n'est pas catholique. I'll get the next one right. In Switzerland, if you want to get on a bus or a tram, you have to buy a ticket in advance. You can buy the whole one of them in advance if you like. And then before you get onto the conveyance, you stick it in a little machine which does something to it that the inspector will recognize. It stamps it or puts a hole in it or something like that. Now, in German Switzerland, what you are invited to do to your ticket is entwerten. Wert is the same root as the English word worth. Entwerten means to invalidate. Ent means roughly in, werten means roughly validate, entwerten means to invalidate. In the French part of Switzerland, what you do is to valider, which means to validate. It's what you must do, by the way, is exactly the same thing, right? In English, actually, this curious thing also crops up because in English you either validate, a rather positive thing to do to your ticket, or you cancel it, which is as close to invalidating as I can easily imagine. Or, of course, you just bug out on the whole thing and you just talk about it on a purely physical level. You punch it in English, or composter. I'm not sure what composter really means in French, but it means to do something with a ticket. I don't think you can do anything else. Now, what's interesting about that is that the words have exactly opposite meaning, even though they mean exactly the same thing, right? Invalidate and validate. In this particular context, you have to know, and it turns out that in Italy, whether it's validare or invalidare depends upon the particular commune that you're in, and doesn't have any linguistic significance at all. All right. Another thing that in practice the designers of machine translation systems have to worry about is that, of course, everybody knows that they can't be used for poetry, they can't be used for belles lettres of any reasonable, they can't really be used for anything that's going to have any wide distribution. So typically the input to a machine translation system that's actually going to be used is pretty lousy in the first place. And it's not hard to find lousy English, well, not so good English, used in sort of high status circumstances. Have you noticed that in the introduction to Masterpiece Theatre, it always says that they are indebted to Mobil Oil, which invites you to join with them, which and them, in supporting public television. Nobody minds. I mean, they either support public television or not. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they use the right pronouns. This morning, on my way here, I didn't write it down because it would have been dangerous to traffic, but I heard something like, there will be occasional showers in the expected forecast for this evening. It was something like that, and of course it's all right, so long as you get sort of the right words in there. There's expectation and forecast, and there are going to be some showers and so on. You get all that stuff in there, the rest doesn't matter very much. It's like, what is it? Don't buy a cat if you don't want any mice in your house. Well, that obviously means what it ought to mean, right? In the European Economic Community, a large amount of what has to be by law translated is written in English by non-native speakers of English. What they write is a language which has come to be known as Euro-English. And what that is English with a lot of frayed edges to it. I mean, it doesn't have any particular properties other than that. So any working machine translation that they build, and they, of course, are people that really need them, is going to have to handle English which is frayed at the edges. Okay. A lot of work was done on machine translation starting right around 1958, curiously enough. And it went on full bore here in the United States and in Europe and in Japan and in China and a variety of other places for 10 years. And then in 1967, this book came out. Now, this book, I'm holding it up for you because there's a lot of talk about it, but very few people have actually seen this book. This is a very important book in machine translation. It is known as the ALPAC report, the report of the automatic language, the automatic ALPAC, automatic language PAC. The last two letters are advisory committee. Automatic Language Processing Advisory Committee. And they more or less said, look, government and others, you are pouring your water down, your money down a rat hole. We don't need this translation stuff, and even if we did need it, these guys who are spending all the money are not going to give it to us. They said the need for translation is very small, that we have or could easily find enough people to do it if we wanted to. The machine translation that we're able to produce now is pretty awful. The machine translation that we expect to be able to produce 10 years from now will also be pretty awful. Therefore, we should not use machine translation. What we should do is to concentrate on basic research which might eventually enable machine translation. And all of these recommendations were accepted, of course, except for the last one. There was no funding for anything that could have anything remotely to do with machine translation from then on for approximately another 10 years. Well, it's said that we need machine translation very badly now. An answer to the ALPAC report was recently produced in Japan. I like to think that one of the reasons why it was produced is that I have been going around the world from conference to conference saying to people who are making claims about machine translation, beware ALPAC 2. Do not claim that you are going to solve practical problems for people unless you are really sure that you can do it. And these people have tried to diffuse this in actually a very clever way, I think, by going through the terms of the ALPAC report and showing what has changed and showing that people who are working on machine translation today have a much more modest view of what they can achieve. But we do need, it's claimed, machine translation. We need it because the volume of translation that has to be done for good or bad reason is going up all the time. There is great worry in the government of this country about machine translation because we can't read those papers that we believe, if we could read them, would tell us what the Japanese were doing and how it works. Furthermore, it's important that we should be able to do machine translation if the Japanese can do machine translation at all because, well, it's just a matter of pride, isn't it? Also, it's important to have machine translation because otherwise you simply won't get things fast enough. Canadian law says that Hansard has to be translated by tomorrow, not next week. It's got to be out the very next day. A lot of things in Europe are needed by the very next day also. Claim is there aren't enough people around to do that. And people cost a lot. Good translators are very expensive. In Scandinavia, where a lot of translation is done for legal purposes, it costs somewhere between 50 cents and $1 a word to get high-quality translation of some kinds of text. Curiously enough, I have heard it claimed that we need machine translation for accuracy, but this is in a very peculiar situation which I won't dwell on too much. I've heard it claimed by so-called intelligence analysts working for a nameless agency with a post office box in Arlington, Virginia, that they prefer to have machine translations, however bad they may look on the surface, than they do translations done by less than the best human translators, because at least the errors will be consistent and they will be able to tell. They will be able to learn after a while, after a number of years, this curious kind of English, which is what you get as a result of translating Russian into English. I don't know whether that number of years is more than it would take to learn Russian or not. But there is considerably increased interest in this country. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are these things at least going on. There's a very, very old system produced in the 60s called Sistran, still being used here in Europe and in Japan. The reason why it is so successful is not because it's that wonderful fundamentally, but simply because it's been in use for so long that it has huge dictionaries, huge lists of idioms, huge lists of special cases, which make it marginally better than other approaches that use essentially the same methods that they do. And as I will hope to convince you in the few minutes that remain, there is in fact only one approach basically being used. So Sistran wins in the margin, as it were.
Agreement with Sistran. Don't there was some sort of joint agreement?
You said it, right? I was going to be very, gentlemanly about that. Yes, we do. What we do is this. We have maintenance manuals for machines which are written in a special language designed so that it will be translatable, known as, for some reason, multinational customized English. And I don't know why it's called that. You write your manuals in this. It's a wonderful language. I've read it. The grammar manual has a page in which it says, the following list of words are both verbs they're both transitive verbs and nouns, and you can use them in either capacity. If they are nouns, there must be an article immediately before them. Not an unreasonable rule. If they are verbs, there must be an article immediately following them. Because they're transitive verbs, they've got to have an object, see? So much for Sistran. The Pan American Health Organization has been writing its own machine translation system for Spanish. It's basically the same idea. It was very self-consciously based on Sistran, but it's sort of recoded and is not in assembly language anymore, and one or two sort of things like that, but it's basically the same notion. Then we make a big shift of gears and go to Carnegie Mellon University, where they use what's called the kitchen sink approach to machine translation. Basically what you do is you put in your program everything that you can think of you build. For example, using AI you build a model of the world, and various, start with a model of the world and then syntax and all the other things, and pragmatic components, and so there's a huge diagram that lays out all the parts of this, and all that remains to be done, as far as I know, is to sort of fill in the details a bit about the world, for example. The Linguistics Research Center at the University of Texas has been working on machine translation since the 50s. It's the only center in the world, I think, that has an unbroken record. It has worked for just about everybody. The last system it produced is called Metal and was delivered to Siemens, and Siemens now have it in Munich and are wondering what to do with it. There's an experimental system written in Prolog at IBM. There's a very old company called Logos that started out in Middletown, New York, working on Vietnamese and is now doing Japanese somewhere else. Company that started out as Alps, now become AlpNet. They pretend to produce what is called aids for translators, not complete machine translation systems, but what that turns out to mean when you look closely at it is it's a machine translation system that does so poorly that what you say is you're really only making suggestions, you were never really trying to get the right answer in the first place. It drives translators absolutely mad, but at least you can make different kinds of claims about it. In Europe, some $30 million has been spent over the last 7 years on a huge collaborative project which at any given moment had working on it on the order of 100 people. It's called Eurotra. And it didn't produce it didn't even produce a prototype machine translation system. It did, however, teach a fair amount of computational linguistics to a lot of people that wouldn't otherwise have learnt it. So the chances are that it has served a useful function, if only an educational one. The University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology has work going on Japanese, but nothing that actually works yet. JETA has been in existence almost as long as the Linguistics Research Center at the University of Texas. Hasn't produced quite as much, however. Metal, well, I put that in Europe now. That's what the Texas system is called when it gets to Europe. Rosetta is actually a rather interesting experimental machine translation system being put together by the people at Philips in Holland. And I have to mention BSO. There are lots of others. This is not meant to be a complete list. The nice thing about BSO, I really kind of like this, they really do have a unique approach to machine translation. They translate everything from its original language into Esperanto, and then from Esperanto into the target language, thus greatly simplifying everything. In Japan, there has been for a number of years a government-sponsored national project, as they call it, the MU system, or the MU project, which was conducted at the University of Kyoto for a number of years. It produced a thoroughgoing working system with a large grammar and 50,000 words in its dictionary and so forth, and the results of this initial project were then given to a large number of companies. I wrote down the ones that I could think of, and there are that many again, who are now developing this, some in one way, some in another. But if you ask any of them for details, the details that you get are always the same details that you would have got from the original MU project. That's to say, you never actually find out that anything genuinely new has been done. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been. There is also a government-sponsored automatic translation research institute, and independently a very large project to produce dictionaries in English and Japanese and bilingual dictionaries in the two, which can be used by machine translation systems. So there's a lot of activity going on since the ALPAC report was produced. So what are these people doing? How does machine translation actually work? You see, I left myself 10 minutes. We've got plenty of time for this. The standard canonical diagram looks like this. It's broken down into pieces. I'm going to change an important detail of this diagram in a minute. This is really a diagram that corresponds to what's called the interlingual approach to machine translation. You start with some original text here. You normalize its spelling. What does that mean? Well, it means that when you put an S on the end of an English word, it usually just sits there, but if the word happens to be bus, then it gets an E in front of it, and if it happens to be try, the Y disappears, and you get an IE instead, and stuff like that. Some letters double sometimes, that kind of stuff. You normalize the spelling, you get a normalized text, you do a morphological analysis, you recognize ED and ING and S and an on the beginning of the word and stuff like that. You get a string of morphemes, it's a fancy linguist name for these little bits that you cut the words up into. You use those to do a syntactic analysis, and in principle you go on up to ever higher levels of abstraction in the representation of what started out simply as a string of characters. And at a certain point the argument goes, if you have chosen the right abstractions and the right path to them, then you will reach a representation that is in fact independent of the language that you first started with and captures only the meaning of that text. This is the idealization, obviously. What you then do is reverse the process, come down the other side, build up a syntactic representation, glue the morphemes together into words, unnormalize the spelling, and wind up with a text in the target language. There are relatively few machine translation systems that follow this plan exactly as laid out here, and those that do are avowedly experimental ones. The modification that you have to make to get to the ones that are actually being used is that when you get to a certain point, you say, well, to hell with this, and you put in a little thing called transfer, which goes directly from wherever you happen to be on one side to the other side using code that you write. And they're all of this general kind, and the arguments about this point out that the transfer could in principle occur at every level, but it always occurs exactly where I put it, between the syntactic the output of the syntactic analysis produces input to the syntactic generation. That's where it always happens, so that the transfer consists of tree manipulation rules, getting the subject which is here in this language over to here in the output language, and doing various rearrangements, basically. That's the basic thing that happens in transfer. So this is the transfer approach, and it's the approach that essentially everybody is using. And that was another picture of it by somebody else. Well, what has changed since 1967? Is it really reasonable that we should be getting involved in all this stuff again, given that those diagrams that I've just showed you haven't changed a great deal, and the content of the boxes hasn't changed a whole lot? What has changed? Certain things we know have changed in computing. We now have much bigger machines, and they run a whole lot faster. No doubt about that. We know a lot more about the management of complexity in programs. We have much, much better programming languages, very much more expressive, and in particular, very important for linguistic work, we know a lot about how to handle non-determinism. That's to say, if it is true that ambiguity is an important problem, then we can recognize and deal with ambiguities, we can represent ambiguities, we can find them all in the programs that we write. The trouble is that having found them all, nobody tells us how to distinguish from among them all the one that we really ought to be translating. Very little has been discovered about the so-called resolution problem. And then there's AI, which has come along and which everybody feels ought to be useful in here. What has changed in linguistics? Well, a lot less, unfortunately. Linguistics is where we need the change. We need to learn a lot more about how language works. And what we have learned is, again, by and large, that there were more problems than we thought there were. We now know of different kinds of problems relating to what's called logical syntax. We've learned a little bit about lexical semantics, about the way to structure a dictionary so as to represent its meanings in a computable manner. There's a notion of so-called case grammar. It doesn't matter very much what that is, but that has sort of contributed a certain amount to being able to compute these things. But the basic thing that we have learned is how to recognize more ambiguity. There is more ambiguity there than we used to think. So that in a sense, the situation is not better, but worse. And we've learned some things in computational linguistics. We've learned how to do morphology, that's to say the decomposition of words, extremely well. We're pretty good at that. We've learned a good discipline having to do with unification and monotonicity, a good discipline for handling syntax. It makes the work easier, but it doesn't make the results a whole lot better. Chats, well, that's supposed to be charts, but I drop a letter now and again. And that's a nice way of dealing with non-determinism. But again, it doesn't solve any of the problems. It merely lets us reach them faster. So what are the alternatives to machine translation? If it's as hard as I say it is, and if we really do need it, and if you really do have to have the translation by tomorrow morning, and if you really can't afford today's costs, what can we do? We can train more translators. We can recognize that English is the language of science and use it for that everywhere, and that is tending to happen to some extent. We can teach people to learn foreign languages, but my experience in this country is that the notion of learning a foreign language is enough to scare anybody off just about anything. We can keep track of translations so that we don't do as we do now, namely translate important things many different times. We can have clearinghouses and such like. All this is dull stuff, so I put a few things in boldface at the bottom just to relieve the monotony. We can look out for special situations where machines really could change things. And I'll talk about that just very briefly. It have to be briefly. We can provide machine aids to translators, which I will warrant could increase their productivity by a factor of 2. Or we could look for situations in which human beings could aid machine translation systems so that the results that they produce were better, because the human being would supply those essential pieces of information that the system was unable to, but the system could do the dog work. Now, it's important to understand that there are different kinds of translations needed and done. If you are taken to court in Finland, if you are the defendant, you may decide which of the two official languages of that country you will be used to refer to any statutes or laws that come up in the case, either Swedish or Finnish, but once you have decided it, it remains in force for the remainder of the trial. It is therefore important, as you can doubtless see, that when framing laws, an effort should be made to make the two versions mean the same thing. Therefore, a page of statute in Finland is typically translated by a large committee of very highly paid people who sit together in a room and translate, if they're doing well, a page a day. Poetry isn't like that, but poetry is hard also. Prestige documents get well translated like this, or if you want a really canonical prestige document, look at the in-flight magazine of Canadian Airlines. You will find that since their image is on the line there, those get superbly well translated and the cost is presumably high. On the other hand, for information retrieval, for figuring out whether the Japanese know what we know or whether the Russians really do have a method of doing this the same, that's as good as our method, all you need to do is to be able to get the gist of things. You don't have to be able to reproduce their algorithm. You just want to know whether it's the same as our algorithm. And that's much easier. So there are all sorts of different levels of translation that you can settle for different purposes. So now let's look in this part of possibilities for recognized sublanguages as one possibility. I mentioned the Xerox one before. Write in a language which you know can be translated. Or, as in the case of the Canadian Meteo system, find such a language naturally occurring. The Meteo system translates the weather reports that are typed out by meteorologists all over Canada to be sent to some central place somewhere or other. That's all done automatically. If it can't be done automatically, then it's given to a human translator, but it's the system that decides to give it. The system decides that it can't translate it. It's not some person that makes that decision. 80% of the stuff is done mechanically, because it turns out that after a few years in the trade, meteorologists give up any pretensions of being particularly inventive in the way they describe snowfall and such. Another very special kind of situation is where you are regularly translating one text into many different languages. This corporation now, when it produces one of these big fancy copiers with a screen on it and so on, and with help messages and error messages and manuals and such like, usually has to produce everything in 10 languages. The same stuff in 10 languages. So that if you imagined a machine translation system that required an awful lot of help disambiguating things and figuring out what referred to what and so forth, it would nevertheless in all probability be worth providing that help, given that you are going to get from it not one translation but 10. That's a very special situation in which it looks like human-aided machine translation might be a good and interesting way to go. The same sort of thing happens in the EEC, where you're typically translating from one language into 8 others. Then there's another special situation where what is being translated is being translated for the author. You are the author. What you want to get is a text in another language, a letter to somebody. So that we can imagine a personal machine translation system which works a little bit like a word processor and is able to ask you as you go on, what do you mean by this, what does it refer to, and so forth. The only trouble with that is that when the other guy at the other end gets the letter, he might reply. So basically, there are numbers of things. There are numbers of things that could be done that would, in my view, almost certainly have a tremendous payoff. They are not what machine translation is, which is still today a batch process conceived in the 1960s and still conducted and researched today as though we were in the 1960s, not recognizing for a moment that a machine might be able to talk back to you. If we recognize that notion and recognize some of these special situations, then I claim that there is something that we could be doing, but we, by which I mean the whole world, are not doing. Thank you.
Extending that point, are there machines, are any of the systems that you know of or that you talked about trying to take advantage of the interaction that might take place with experienced translators and, for example, learn to be better translating systems by guidance?
I think it's hello. But by and large, it has been the case, and by and large, it continues to be the case, that people take it as being obvious what translation is. And I don't know of any case of a machine translation project hiring a translator. Ever. Yeah.
You know whether the Japanese book about machine translated was translated into English by machine?
It was not. Perfectly comprehensible.
What exactly are the Japanese claiming to be able to do at this time?
They are claiming to be able, they are claiming that they have translation systems that can be used, for example, for browsing through Japanese patent disclosures to discover whether there's one like yours. Basically, as far as I can tell, mostly information retrieval kinds of applications. Those are the ones that they talk most about. Yeah.
Is it working on resolving ambiguities, just sort of looking at words in the vicinity, just sort of a statistical way of doing ambiguities?
Yeah. That's actually one of the oldest games in town. It's curious that it hasn't been pursued more, actually, because it does fairly well. The group that I joined in 1958 in Cambridge believed that there was nothing else to machine translation than that. What you did was you looked up all the words in every sentence in Roget's thesaurus, and each word tended to occur in various of the 1,000 numbered paragraphs in there. So you figured out what the words meant by sort of taking a vote. You saw which paragraphs won in the whole text, which one in this paragraph of the text, which one in this sentence, and then you looked for things in the other language that occurred in the corresponding paragraph. Now, there's a lot more in here. There's no syntax in that, but syntax, these were philosophers. For the most part, syntax was held to be rather dull. Getting the words right was the main thing, which perhaps it is.
I didn't quite catch your personal outlook on all of this. I mean, you told us what the world has done, what the world is doing, and you expressed some observations about alternative things that could be done. Do you personally feel that this is an exciting research area that you'd like to work on yourself and see people at Xerox PARC work on?
I think that it is the single most interesting and productive matrix within which to do work on natural language. I think that there is no more exciting way to make sure that everything that you do is in fact on the subject that you think it's about, than to make sure that it actually fits into a translation system. But I think that's a research strategy. I have no idea when that strategy will pay off or whether the payoff will be anything to do with machine translation. A lot of the payoff that we've had around here has been in spelling correctors. But it's nevertheless a lot of what people were doing on that was initially working on theoretical machine translation systems. So on the one hand, yes, I think it's a wonderful thing to work on, extremely productive, could have fallout in ways predictable and unpredictable. Quite different matter, what do I think ought to be done about the real pressing needs for translation? I think 100 different things, a whole list of things with machine translation at the very bottom. It is the very last thing we should consider because it is the one which is going to pay off only in the longest term, if ever. There are so many other things that could be done, indefinitely many other things that could be done, which involve the sorts of things that we all know about around here, appropriate mixes of computers and people. That's what's needed. That's what this place, I think, has made its name in, and I think machine translation or translation using machines is one of the ways in which we could make our mark again. Yeah.
I think I heard you make the same plea about 10 or 15 years ago here for sort of online aids for translation. Has anything happened since then? Has anybody done anything in that area?
There is coming to be just now, just in the last couple of years, not only lip service to this idea, but some attempt to build systems that have some of this character. For a long time, people produced what they called machine-aided translation systems, but what they were, as I characterized them before, they were in fact failed machine translation systems, where the idea was that somebody would sweep up afterwards. And actually, they're unusable because any translator is so insulted by the stuff that he's given to work with, he'd rather do anything than work with a machine of this sort that simply produces him systematically misleading stuff that he has to delete from his screen. So that's what was done. There was lip service paid to the idea, but the old stuff was done. Now there is just coming to be some interest in doing it, as I would say for short, right.
Thank you.
Thank you.